There's a drug that cures it all, blocked by the governmental war. We are the scientists inside the lab, just waiting for the call.
The FDA has the duty of keeping Americans safe by regulating the food and drugs they use. This means the FDA places regulations on clinical trials, drug tests on humans, primarily for the patient's safety. However, if the restrictions become too strict, it can lead to delayed and more expensive drug productions. The regulations must require the trials to run sufficient tests without any bureaucratic rules. The restrictions on these trials control what happens, therefore they are imperative. The primary purpose of the FDA is to ensure that the food Americans eat and the medication they take is safe and clean. Another duty of the FDA is placing regulations on clinical trials. In order for a drug to be sold, it must be tested on humans for safety purposes. This happens through a clinical trial. The balance of these regulations must be as close to perfect as possible. It is necessary that the FDA pleases as many Americans as possible, including the patients. The FDA must make certain that the patient knows what will happen in the trial. They also must ensure that the drug is tested thoroughly. With so many people involved with the FDA and their regulations, there are many different perspectives. While one trial participant believes that some of the regulations make the process more bureaucratic and complex, a clinical investigator feels that the regulations are simply protecting the patients. Without the FDA, the patients would not be universally protected from potentially harmful drugs.
I am a clinical investigator, therefore I do studies with new drugs in development. They're basically following some universal guidelines which practically the whole world globally has to use to protect the patient.
Okay.
So that aspect of the FDA's regulations I feel are in the good of the person who's in the study. They are there to protect them.
Okay.
This is important because people could be taken advantage of. Or you could give them induce them to do certain things which may not be in their, which they may not otherwise do. Now the FDA does multiple things as far as clinical trials are concerned. On one side of the story, they want to protect the patient within the study, the subject. The other part the FDA plays is to make sure that the medication or the new drug that you're giving them has been adequately tested and is safe to be used in humans. So they look at all the data that has been gathered in developing that drug before it is given. So from both those aspects, their ultimate role is to protect the human patient in the study. We could streamline in the way in which companies can apply for these requests. We could also allow, right now the FDA does not allow clinical data or research studies done in other countries to be acceptable here. They want it done all over again if the drug needs to be used in the US. That wastes a lot of money and time. If that was not there, then medications may be at a slightly cheaper cost. But otherwise, I think what they're doing is appropriate.
Although one clinical investigator feels that the majority of the FDA's regulations on clinical trials are not too strict, it is not a broad enough survey to draw any final conclusions. This interview does show the reasoning behind that perspective, though. Around the world, especially in the past, some prisoners were forced to do research and participate in unsafe trials. The FDA has the duty of making certain that the patients are fully informed. The overall purpose of the FDA is to protect the patients, and if the regulations were to become too strict, it would lead to delayed production. If this were to happen, the drug would not be accessible to the public until later, which would raise the price. The FDA's restrictions are not perfect, and they might never be, but there are some specific actions that could be taken in order to improve the business. The FDA plays an important role in drug productions, but some of the regulations can be too strict.